Hi there. If you're here, chances are you're looking for two things: a little history and a lot of sleep. So go ahead, lie back. Pull that blanket up like it's the only thing standing between you and a cold draft from the 14th century. Maybe dim the lights. Maybe pretend the hum of your fan is a distant winter wind rattling the shutters of a very leaky cottage. Tonight, we're not going to warm castles or shining suits of armor. We're going to the mud, to smoke-filled huts, creaky wooden doors, and the kind of cold that doesn't just nip at your nose. It moves in, takes your bed, and asks what's for dinner. This is the medieval winter. No glory, no knights, just peasants, frozen turnips, and a lot of chores no one wants to talk about. So close your eyes, and let's take a quiet, slightly uncomfortable step back into a time when the only central heating was a goat. Expectations versus reality, the Middle Ages. A time of gallant knights, noble quests, and hearty feasts by roaring fires. You've seen the movies. You've read the stories. Maybe you've even thought, I could have made it back then. I like candles. Well, settle in because we need to talk. The thing is, Hollywood got it wrong. Not just a little wrong, spectacularly, magnificently wrong. Like wearing flip-flops to climb Everest wrong. Because being a peasant in medieval winter wasn't like a fairy tale. It was more like a survival challenge, without the camera crew, without the prize money, and definitely without the fleece-lined parka. Let's start with what you probably picture. Those charming Christmas card villages, right? Snow-dusted cottages with warm light glowing through diamond-paned windows. Smoke curling cheerfully from chimneys. Maybe a few carolers wandering about with rosy cheeks and knowing grins. Yeah, no. Most medieval villages in winter look like someone had taken a construction site, abandoned it for 6 months, then covered it with slush. There were no picturesque sleigh rides through snow-covered lanes. There was mud, then frozen mud, then snow covering the frozen mud, and under that, surprise, more mud. The kind of mud that grabbed your boot and held it hostage until spring. The roads? Let's be generous and call them suggestions. They were more like scars across the landscape where people had given up and decided to walk anyway. In winter, these became ice-slicked obstacle courses that claimed ankles and dignity in equal measure. You didn't stroll through a medieval village in January. You slipped, slid, and occasionally belly-flopped your way from point A to point B. And those cottages? Most homes weren't stone cottages with ivy and cheerful smoke curling from the chimney. They were, well, let's be kind and call them rustic. Handmade, half-rotted, mostly leaning structures that seemed to stay upright through sheer stubbornness and possibly prayer. If your roof didn't cave in under snow, it was considered a win. If the thatch didn't house 3 generations of mice, it was considered a miracle worthy of sainthood. Picture this. You're lying in what passes for your bed, which is probably a straw mattress that's seen better decades, and you hear a creak, then another creak, then a sound like someone slowly tearing paper, except the paper is your roof, and the person tearing it is physics. You'd lie there in the dark, listening to the timber groan under the weight of snow, calculating whether you should risk getting up to poke at the sagging beam or just accept that you might be excavated come morning. The walls weren't much better. Wattle and daub construction sounds quaint until you realize it's basically sticks and mud with delusions of grandeur. In summer, the daub would crack and let in flies. In winter, it would freeze and let in wind. There was no happy medium. Just different types of discomfort scheduled by season. Windows? Oh, you sweet modern soul. If you were wealthy enough to have actual glass, and we're talking minor nobility wealthy, not successful chicken merchant wealthy, you'd have tiny panes about the size of playing cards. Most people made do with oiled cloth or scraped animal hide stretched across openings. It let in about as much light as you'd expect from something that used to be part of a pig. But let's talk about the real adventure. Staying warm. Central heating was still a few centuries away from being invented, and even then it would take another few centuries to reach anyone who wasn't living in a palace. Your heat source was fire, just fire. One fire, usually in the center of your one room, with the smoke theoretically escaping through a hole in the roof. Theoretically. In practice, smoke had its own agenda. It would hover near the ceiling like an unwelcome dinner guest, occasionally descending to eye level just to remind you who was really in charge. You'd develop what we might charitably call medieval squint, that perpetual slight closing of the eyes that came from living in a perpetual light haze. The fire itself was a full-time job. You couldn't just flip a switch or turn a thermostat. You had to feed it constantly, like a very demanding and potentially deadly pet. Run out of wood? Well, that's unfortunate. Forget to bank the coals properly before bed? Hope you enjoyed warmth, because that relationship is over until you can coax another flame from whatever tinder you've managed to keep dry. And dry was the operative word. Everything was either too wet or too dry, never just right. Your firewood would be damp from snow. Your kindling would be soggy from the perpetual dampness that hung in the air like a humid ghost. Starting a fire in medieval winter wasn't just a skill. It was an art form practiced by cold, frustrated artists whose medium was stubbornly non-flammable. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Dinner. Forget those cinematic feasts with turkey legs and foaming tankards of ale. Winter meals were less turkey leg and mead and more pottage again, with turnip if you were lucky. Pottage, for the uninitiated, was basically medieval everything soup. You took whatever you had, and by winter you had very little, and boiled it until it resembled food. Grain if you had it, vegetables if you'd managed to store them properly, sometimes a bit of salt pork if you were feeling fancy or if it was a religious holiday. Most of the time it was turnips. So many turnips. Turnips that had been sitting in your root cellar since autumn, getting increasingly wrinkled and philosophical about their purpose in life. The root cellar itself was another exercise in optimistic engineering. You'd dig a hole, line it with stones if you could find them, and hope that the combination of earth and prayer would keep your winter supplies from freezing solid or rotting into primordial soup. It was a delicate balance. Too warm and everything spoiled, too cold and you'd be chipping your dinner out of the ground with an axe. And speaking of storage, let's talk about the medieval refrigerator. Outside. Everything was stored outside because outside was a giant natural freezer that required no electricity and never broke down. The downside was that your bacon was now accessible to every hungry animal within a 5-mile radius, and retrieving it required an expedition through snow that might be knee-deep or might be goodbye forever deep. You'd bundle up, and medieval bundling was an art form involving every piece of cloth you owned, layered in strategic combinations, and venture out to hack off a piece of whatever frozen meat was hanging from the eaves. Assuming it was still there? Assuming the rope hadn't snapped under the weight of ice? Assuming a particularly ambitious fox hadn't figured out advanced climbing techniques. But here's the thing that the movies never show you: the smell. Medieval winter had its own particular perfume, a complex bouquet of wood smoke, unwashed humans, damp wool, cooking food, and the various biological necessities of life lived in close quarters. It wasn't necessarily unpleasant. You got used to it, the way you get used to anything when you don't have a choice. But it was definitely present. Everyone smelled like smoke. Your clothes, your hair, your skin. Everything carried the scent of whatever wood you'd been burning. Oak, if you were lucky. Pine, if you were desperate. And mystery wood that we found in the forest and hoped for the best, if you were really desperate. You could identify your neighbors by their particular smoke signature from 50 yards away. And sure, there were castles, those towering monuments to having enough money to build something that doesn't fall down. But you weren't in one. You were probably within smelling distance of one, though. Downwind, naturally catching the occasional whiff of whatever exotic spices the Lord's cook was using while you contemplated your turnip pottage with the focused intensity of a food critic. The castle folk had their own problems, of course. Stone walls might be impressive, but they were also excellent at absorbing cold and radiating it back at you all winter long. They had tapestries, sure, but tapestries were basically decorative draft stoppers. Better than nothing, but not by much. Even nobility spent winter mornings breathing visible clouds of their own breath, while servants scurried around trying to coax warmth from fireplaces the size of small caves. But here's where it gets interesting, where the real story lives. People made it work, somehow. They adapted, the way humans do when the alternative is freezing to death. They layered what little they had with the efficiency of someone who understood that every scrap of cloth might be the difference between comfort and misery. Wool against the skin if they had it, linen over that, more wool on top, leather if they could manage it. Everything they owned, worn at once, like walk-in closets with feet. They huddled close to the hearth, or to each other, or to the animals, because shared body heat was free and pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. Families would sleep in one bed not for romance or tradition, but for survival. Children in the middle because they were small and needed the most warmth. Adults on the outside like living blankets with opinions. They turned frozen mornings into routines because routine made the unbearable bearable. Wake up, assess whether anyone had died in the night. Hopefully not. Rebuild the fire from whatever coals had survived. Check the animals, break the ice on the water bucket, and begin another day of existing despite the weather's best efforts. And they found warmth in community, because community was the medieval equivalent of central heating. Neighbors checking on neighbors, sharing resources when they could, gathering in the one house with the best fire to tell stories, sing songs and pretend that spring was just around the corner instead of still months away. Occasionally they found warmth in the body heat of a very confused goat who had wandered into the house and decided that indoor living wasn't so bad after all. Animals had their own survival instincts, and sometimes those instincts led them straight through your front door. You'd wake up to find a chicken roosting on your table or a pig snoring by your fire, and you'd have to make a practical decision: evict the intruder or charge rent. They developed winter games that required no equipment beyond imagination and the ability to endure cold. Children would play counting breaths, seeing how many visible puffs they could make before their parents told them to stop wasting heat. Adults would compete to see who could split the most kindling before losing feeling in their fingers. Elderly folks would judge ice formations like modern wine critics, debating the artistic merits of different icicle formations with the seriousness of people who had plenty of time and very few entertainment options. But mostly they waited. They endured. They survived winter the way you survive a particularly long and uncomfortable dental procedure, by accepting that it's happening, that it will eventually end, and that complaining won't make it go faster. So no, it wasn't magical. There were no Christmas miracles or heartwarming moments of fellowship around perfectly appointed dinner tables. It was cold and hard and frequently unpleasant in ways that modern comfort has taught us to forget. But it was real. Achingly, completely real. And tonight, we're not glamorizing it or romanticizing it or pretending it was somehow better than what we have now. We're stepping into it. Slowly, gently, like someone walking barefoot across a frozen dirt floor in the dark, feeling each cold plank beneath their feet, hearing each creak of the floorboards, breathing each visible puff of air, because that was life, raw, unfiltered, without apology or explanation. It didn't wait for spring, or ask permission, or pause for your convenience. It simply was, and people lived it, one cold day at a time, until the wheel turned and warmth returned to the world. The truly fascinating part wasn't just how they survived, but how they managed to find moments of actual joy in the middle of all that hardship. Picture this. It's February. the worst month in the medieval calendar when winter had worn out its welcome but showed no signs of leaving. The stored food was running low. Everyone was tired of turnip pottage, and cabin fever was setting in with the intensity of a particularly persistent plague. And then someone would remember that they had a bit of honey left over from autumn. Not much, maybe enough for a spoonful each, but they'd heat it over the fire, mix it with some of their precious grain, and suddenly you had honey cakes. Were they fancy? Absolutely not. Were they life-changing after months of bland pottage? You'd better believe it. Or there were the storytelling contests that would spring up on the longest nights, when darkness fell at what felt like noon and wouldn't lift until what felt like the following Tuesday. People would gather around whoever had the biggest fire, and the stories would begin. Tales that grew more elaborate with each telling. Legends that accumulated details like snow accumulates on a roof. Slowly, steadily, until you had something magnificent and completely unstable. The village wise woman might tell stories of summer that were so vivid you could almost smell the flowers. Children would contribute tales that made absolutely no sense but somehow captured the essential absurdity of life better than any adult logic. And the old men would tell stories of previous winters, each one apparently worse than the current one, until you started to feel positively spoiled by your current circumstances. "This is nothing," they'd wheeze, gesturing at the snow piled against the windows. Back in my day, the snow was so deep we had to dig tunnels between houses. Took 3 men and a prayer just to find the privy. Whether this was true or not was beside the point. The point was that someone had survived worse and lived to complain about it, which meant you probably would too. There were the feast days, scattered through winter like small lights in a long tunnel. Not grand celebrations. Nobody had the resources for grand anything. But moments when the community would pool whatever they had and make something special happen. A bit of preserved meat that had been saved for months. Some ale that had been hoarded like liquid gold. Maybe someone had managed to keep an apple or two from the autumn harvest, wrinkled now but still sweet. These weren't Instagram-worthy medieval banquets. They were more like potluck dinners, organized by people who understood that sometimes the most important ingredient in any meal is hope. Everyone would contribute what they could, even if what they could contribute was just their presence and their appetite for whatever miracle the group had managed to cobble together. And the music, dear God, the music. When you don't have books or television or any form of entertainment beyond what you can create yourself, you get very good at creating entertainment. Someone always had a pipe, or knew how to whistle, or could drum a rhythm on whatever was handy. Voices would join in, harmonizing not because they were trained singers, but because harmony was free and made everything sound more beautiful. They'd sing work songs while doing tedious tasks, turning the monotony of preparing flax or mending tools into something almost pleasant. They'd sing lullabies that their grandmothers had sung, passing down melodies like heirlooms. And on the worst nights, when the wind was howling and the cold was creeping through every crack, they'd sing just to fill the silence with something human and warm. The religious aspects of winter weren't just about duty or obligation. They were about finding meaning in the endurance. When your life was reduced to the basics of survival, faith became less abstract and more practical. Prayer wasn't just a Sunday activity. It was what you did when you were banking the fire for the night and hoping it would last until morning. When you were checking on a sick neighbor and hoping your presence would help. When you were rationing the last of the grain and hoping it would stretch until spring. The church calendar gave structure to the long winter months. Advent wasn't just a religious season. It was a countdown to the shortest day, a promise that light would return. Christmas wasn't just a celebration. It was proof that you'd made it halfway through winter. Candlemas in February wasn't just about blessing candles. It was about acknowledging that the days were getting longer, even if they were still cold as a witch's. Well, let's keep this family friendly. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how they maintained their sense of humor. When you're living in conditions that would make a modern camping enthusiast pack up and go home, you have two choices: laugh or go completely mad. Medieval peasants chose laughter with the determination of people who understood that sanity was a luxury worth fighting for. They'd joke about the mice in the thatch as if they were troublesome tenants behind on rent. They'd give names to particularly persistent drafts, discussing them like unwelcome relatives who'd overstayed their welcome. "Oh, that's just Uncle North Wind again. Can't take a hint." They'd develop elaborate theories about why certain logs burned better than others, debating the personality traits of different types of wood with the seriousness of philosophers. The children, bless them, treated winter like an extended adventure in creative problem-solving. They'd build snow forts that were architectural marvels of impracticality. They'd invent games that required nothing but imagination and the ability to find fun in circumstances that would challenge the spirits of hardened survivalists. They'd ice skate on frozen puddles with shoes that had no business being used for ice skating, falling down with the enthusiasm of people who understood that falling was just part of the experience. And they'd help with adult tasks, not because they were forced to, but because helping was what you did. Children would carry kindling, tend fires, help with cooking, and generally make themselves useful with the matter-of-fact competence of people who'd never known any other way to live. They weren't being exploited, they were being included. They were learning that survival was a community effort and that everyone had a role to play. The elderly were particularly valued during winter, not just for their wisdom but for their memories. They were living libraries of practical knowledge. Which herbs helped with winter coughs? How to tell if ice was thick enough to walk on? What weather signs meant what? They'd tell stories not just to entertain but to educate, passing down survival techniques disguised as entertainment. Now, when your grandmother was young, they'd begin, and everyone would settle in to learn something valuable wrapped in the comfortable familiarity of a well-told tale. These weren't just stories. They were instruction manuals for life, teaching guides for how to be human in difficult circumstances. The craftspeople would use winter's enforced indoor time to create things of beauty. Woodcarvers would spend hours by the fire, creating useful objects that were also works of art. A spoon didn't just have to be functional, it could also be beautiful. A chest didn't just have to hold things, it could also please the eye. When your world was reduced to the basics, making those basics beautiful became a form of resistance against despair. Women would spin and weave, not just out of necessity, but with an attention to pattern and color that transformed utility into art. They'd dye yarn with whatever materials they could find, creating shades that brought warmth to the eye even when the body was cold. They'd incorporate designs that told stories, creating textiles that were both functional and meaningful. Even the men would engage in what we might call crafts, though they'd probably object to the term. They'd carve toys for children, mend tools with an attention to detail that went beyond mere function, create simple musical instruments from whatever materials were available. When entertainment was scarce, you became your own entertainment industry, and through it all, there was this incredible sense of we're all in this together. Not because someone told them to feel that way, but because it was literally true. Your neighbor's fire going out wasn't just their problem. It was everyone's problem, because a house without heat was a house full of people who needed help. And helping wasn't charity. It was investment in the community bank of mutual aid that everyone would need to draw from sooner or later. They shared not because they were naturally generous, though many were, but because sharing was practical. Your neighbor's children might marry yours someday. Your neighbor's skills might save your life next week. Your neighbor's goodwill might be the difference between eating and starving if your own supplies ran short. Community wasn't just nice, it was necessary. And somewhere in all of this, in the shared struggles and small triumphs, in the stories and songs and moments of unexpected sweetness, in the daily choice to keep going when keeping going was hard, they created something that was genuinely beautiful. Not the sanitized, romanticized beauty of fairy tales, but the real beauty of humans being human together, making the best of circumstances that were often quite literally life and death. So when we step into their world tonight, we're not just stepping into hardship. We're stepping into resilience. We're witnessing the daily miracle of people who faced winter, real winter, unheated and relentless, and didn't just survive it, but found ways to make it meaningful. And somewhere in that reality, in that honest acknowledgement of hardship met with stubborn human persistence, there's something oddly comforting. Not the hardship itself, but the proof that people can endure it, can find ways to make even the coldest, darkest winters bearable through nothing more complicated than showing up for each other and refusing to give up. Which, when you think about it, isn't so different from how we get through difficult times now, just with better heating and fewer confused goats. A day in the life you wake up before the sun, not because you're ambitious or because you've embraced some medieval version of rise and grind, not because you're naturally an early bird, or because you've discovered the life-changing magic of morning routines. You wake up because your breath is visible and your toes have just reminded you they still exist. By going completely, utterly numb, it's that special kind of cold that seeps through everything. The straw mattress beneath you, the wool blanket above you, the very air around you. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill your body but seems to settle into your bones and make itself at home. Your first conscious thought isn't "good morning, world." It's more like, oh, right, winter. Still happening. The mattress is straw, and not the clean golden straw you might picture from harvest paintings. This is straw that's been slept on for months, compressed into something that resembles bedding, but feels more like sleeping on a poorly constructed scarecrow. It pokes through whatever fabric covering it once had, which wasn't much to begin with. Every position is uncomfortable in its own special way. The blanket is actually your cloak. The same cloak you wore yesterday and will wear again today because it's the warmest thing you own, and laundry is a weekly ordeal you're not ready to face yet. It smells like wet sheep, wood smoke, and the accumulated sense of hard living. You've long since stopped noticing the smell, the way you stopped noticing the sound of your own breathing. Someone's elbow is lodged firmly in your ribs. Could be your spouse, could be your child, could be your elderly parent. In winter, sleeping arrangements are less about privacy and more about survival mathematics. How many bodies can you fit in one bed while still allowing everyone to breathe? The answer, you've learned through trial and error, is more than you'd think. Someone else, and honestly, at this point it might be a cousin, might be the neighbor's kid who got caught in the storm last night, might be the goat named Marta who has strong opinions about indoor living, is snoring with the steady rhythm of someone who's mastered the art of sleeping through discomfort. You don't complain. Complaining requires energy you don't have and won't accomplish anything anyway. You just lie there for a moment, taking inventory. Toes numb but present. Fingers stiff but functional. Lower back sending signals that could either mean you're still alive or that you're slowly transitioning to some new state of existence that's neither fully living nor completely dead. The pain in your lower back is your body's way of saying, "Good morning, remember me? I'm the collection of bones and muscles that's been sleeping on compressed straw and supporting manual labor for longer than anyone should reasonably expect." You shift slightly, trying to find a position that doesn't involve sharp straw poking through the fabric, and immediately disturb the carefully negotiated sleeping arrangements of everyone else in the bed. A grunt from your left, a mumbled complaint from your right. The goat, definitely the goat, opens one judgmental eye as if to say, "Really? We're doing this now?" Outside, the wind moans like it lost a bet with winter and is being forced to pay up by harassing every piece of loose thatch, every poorly fitted shutter, every gap between the logs that make up your walls. It's not the gentle whoosh of wind through trees that poets write about. It's the sound of air that's personally offended by the existence of your house and is determined to find every possible way inside. Inside, your home is dark because dawn is still hours away, and windows are either non-existent or covered with whatever you could find to keep the wind out. It's smoky because the fire never completely dies, and the chimney, such as it is, has its own ideas about which direction smoke should travel. And it's cold in the kind of way that feels personal, like winter has specifically chosen your house for special attention. The darkness isn't the gentle darkness of a modern bedroom with blackout curtains. It's the thick, complete darkness of a world without electric lights, where the only illumination comes from whatever embers are still glowing in the fireplace. You can't see your hand in front of your face, but you know exactly where everything is because you've lived in this space long enough to navigate it by feel, by memory, by the particular way the floorboards creak under your feet. Your first job? The fire. Always the fire. Everything else in your day depends on whether you can coax those embers back to life. If the embers survive the night, and this is never guaranteed, despite your best efforts at banking them properly before bed, you can nurse them back to life with the careful attention of someone who understands that fire is the difference between surviving the day and becoming a very cold statistic. You slip out from under the communal blanket, trying not to disturb the complex arrangement of bodies and limbs that's kept everyone warm through the night. The floor is wooden planks, rough-hewn and uneven, and they're cold enough to make you gasp when your bare feet touch them. You don't have slippers. Slippers are a luxury for people who have enough shoes to designate some specifically for indoor use. You kneel by the fireplace, not because kneeling is comfortable, but because the embers are low and you need to get close. Your knees protest against the cold stone hearth. But your knees have been protesting a lot of things lately, and you've learned to ignore their complaints. The embers are there, barely glowing, like tiny red jewels buried in gray ash. You blow gently, and they brighten for a moment before settling back into their sullen glow. This is the critical moment. Too much air too fast, and you'll scatter the ash and kill what little heat remains. Too little, and they'll die anyway, leaving you with the much harder task of starting a fire from scratch. You add tinder, bits of dry grass, bark, whatever combustible material you've managed to keep dry and ready. Your fingers are stiff with cold, making fine motor control an interesting challenge. The tinder catches, and for a moment you have actual flames, small and precious and absolutely crucial to everything that follows. Kindling comes next. Small twigs, thin strips of wood, anything that will catch easily and burn hot enough to ignite larger pieces. You add them one at a time, building a careful structure that allows air to flow while protecting the growing flames. It's architecture on a tiny scale, and getting it wrong means starting over. Success smells like smoke and survival and the particular satisfaction of convincing fire to exist when fire would rather not. The flames grow, casting flickering light around the room, and suddenly you can see again. The shadows dance on the walls, and the temperature near the hearth climbs from brutally cold to merely uncomfortably chilly. Failure smells like nothing, and that's worse. Nothing means no heat, no light, no way to cook food or dry clothes or create the warm center around which your entire day revolves. Nothing means starting from scratch with flint and steel, striking sparks into tinder while your hands shake with cold, and your family gradually wakes up to discover that their survival depends on your ability to create fire from stone and metal and prayer. But let's assume success, because you've done this before, because you've gotten good at coaxing life from near-death embers, because failure isn't really an option when failure means everyone stays cold. Next challenge, water. The bucket sits where you left it the night before, by the door, positioned to catch any drips from the roof, but also to be handy for morning needs. It's frozen solid, of course, because water has this inconvenient habit of turning into ice when the temperature drops below freezing and stays there for months. You hack through the top layer of ice with something that once resembled a ladle, but now looks like a medieval ice pick with identity issues. The ice is thick enough that breaking through requires actual effort, and the sound of metal striking ice rings through the quiet morning like a very small, very pathetic bell. You spill some water in the process because precision is difficult when you're working with tools that aren't quite designed for the job and hands that aren't quite awake yet. You curse a little, quietly, because other people are still sleeping, but with the heartfelt conviction of someone who's just lost precious water to the thirsty floorboards. Then comes the trek to the stream, assuming the stream isn't completely frozen, which it might be, in which case you'll need to find another source or melt snow, which is time-consuming and produces surprisingly little water for the amount of snow involved. The stream is maybe 50 yards from your house, which doesn't sound like much until you're making the journey in pre-dawn darkness, wearing boots that could charitably be described as leatherish, and definitely described as inadequate for winter conditions. Your boots, if you can call them that, are stiff with yesterday's snow that melted and refroze overnight. They're not waterproof, they're not particularly warm, and they definitely weren't designed with ice-covered rocks and slippery stream banks in mind. They're more like foot coverings that provide some protection from the worst of the elements while still allowing you to feel every stone, stick, and patch of ice you step on. The path to the stream is treacherous in the dark. You know it by heart, but winter has rearranged the familiar landscape with drifts of snow, patches of ice, and fallen branches that weren't there yesterday. You move carefully, testing each step, because a twisted ankle or a hard fall could turn a simple chore into a genuine crisis. The stream itself is partially frozen, with a thin layer of ice covering the edges and the slow-moving parts, but there's still water flowing in the center. You break through the ice with your bucket, and the sound of water filling the container is oddly satisfying. Proof that you've successfully completed the first major task of the day. Your fingers burn with cold by the time you're done. The metal bucket handle is like holding onto a piece of ice, and your wet hands stick to it briefly before you manage to adjust your grip. Your nose runs constantly in the cold air, and you wipe it with the inside of your sleeve because you've learned to use every piece of fabric for multiple purposes. The trip back to the house is even more treacherous because now you're carrying a bucket of water that wants to slosh and spill with every step. You move slowly, carefully, trying to balance speed with caution, because spilling the water means another trip to the stream, and you're not sure your hands can handle that right now. By the time you get back inside, the fire has grown enough to provide actual warmth within a radius of about 3 feet. You set the bucket near the hearth, but not too close. You want the water to stay liquid, but you don't want it to get so warm that it attracts every insect that somehow survived the winter. Breakfast preparation begins while the rest of the household gradually transitions from sleep to consciousness. This process involves a lot of groaning, coughing, and the sounds people make when they discover that their bodies have been lying on straw all night and have opinions about that. Breakfast is pottage, always pottage, a thick grayish stew that manages to be both the most boring food imaginable and absolutely essential to survival. It's made from whatever grain you have: oats, barley, maybe some wheat if you've been lucky, cooked into a porridge-like consistency that fills your stomach and provides the calories you need to get through a day of manual labor. You reheat yesterday's pottage slowly, stirring with a stick that may or may not have started life as the handle of your last wooden spoon. The consistency is somewhere between soup and paste, and it has the color of something that's given up on being appetizing and settled for being nutritious. A crust of bread on the side if someone didn't eat it during the night. And bread theft is a real concern when you're sharing living space with people who are always hungry and don't always have the best impulse control when it comes to readily available food. You chew slowly, not because you're savoring the flavor, there really isn't any flavor to speak of, but because chewing slowly makes the meal last longer, and psychological satisfaction is almost as important as nutritional satisfaction when food is scarce and meals are repetitive. The pottage is warm, which is its primary virtue. It fills your stomach, which is its secondary virtue. Beyond that, you're not asking for much, because asking for much leads to disappointment, and disappointment is a luxury you can't afford when breakfast is the difference between having energy for the day's work and not. Then comes work, always work. The concept of leisure time is pretty much foreign when survival requires constant attention to the basic necessities of life. If you're a man, your workday starts with checking the animals, assuming you have animals, which you might or might not, depending on your economic status and how well you've managed to keep them alive through previous winters. Chickens, if you have them, need to be fed and watered and coaxed into laying eggs, though chickens in winter are notoriously uncooperative about egg production. You're outside chopping wood because the fire that's keeping everyone alive consumes wood at an alarming rate. And yesterday's wood chopping only provided enough fuel to get you through yesterday. Today's wood chopping needs to provide enough fuel to get you through today. And if you're smart, you're also trying to get a little ahead for tomorrow. Chopping wood in winter is its own special form of exercise. The wood is often partially frozen, which makes it harder to split. The axe handle is cold enough to stick to your skin if you're not careful. Your hands go numb after a while, which makes gripping the axe an interesting challenge. But the rhythm of chopping is oddly meditative once you get into it. Swing, split, stack. Swing, split, stack. The repetitive motion generates body heat, and the growing pile of split wood provides a sense of accomplishment that's rare in a life where most tasks are about maintaining the status quo rather than making progress. Repairing fences is another ongoing winter task because snow and ice and wind have a way of finding every weak point in your construction and exploiting it. A fence that looked perfectly sturdy in autumn might be leaning at an alarming angle come February, held up by nothing more than habit and optimism. Checking traps is both hopeful and often disappointing. You set snares and deadfalls with the optimism of someone who believes that wildlife will cooperate with your survival needs. But wildlife has its own agenda, and that agenda doesn't necessarily include walking into your traps at convenient times. If you're a woman, you're doing literally everything else, which is a job description that includes but is not limited to cooking, spinning, hauling water, washing clothes, watching children, feeding animals, preserving food, making clothes, maintaining the household, and pretending you don't occasionally fantasize about running away to join a convent where someone else would handle the daily logistics of keeping everyone alive. The spinning never stops because thread and yarn are constantly needed for mending clothes, making new clothes, and replacing the countless fabric items that wear out through daily use. You spin while walking, while talking, while supervising children, while waiting for water to boil. Your hands are never idle because idle hands mean no progress on the endless list of textile-related tasks that keep everyone clothed and warm. The children help in theory. In practice, they exist with the concentrated energy of small humans who haven't yet learned that life is supposed to be exhausting and difficult. They chase chickens with the single-minded determination of tiny predators. They sneak handfuls of grain when they think no one's looking. Not because they're bad children, but because they're always hungry and grain is right there. They help with chores in ways that often create more work than they prevent. But their help is still valuable because it's training for the day when they'll need to know how to do these tasks themselves. A 6-year-old's attempt at collecting eggs might result in more broken shells than whole eggs. But that 6-year-old is learning skills that will literally keep them alive someday. The older children are genuinely useful, capable of handling real responsibilities with the competence that comes from necessity. They can tend fires, prepare simple meals, care for younger siblings, and handle basic maintenance tasks. They're not being exploited. They're being prepared for a world where everyone needs to contribute to survival. Laundry day comes once a week if you're lucky, twice a month if you're realistic, and whenever the smell becomes unbearable if you're honest. It's an ordeal worthy of epic poetry, if epic poetry were written about the mundane heroics of domestic life. You drag the clothes to the stream, the same stream you visited for water, but now you need access to a larger area where you can actually work. You break through whatever ice has formed since your last visit, and the sound of your laundry paddle striking ice echoes through the winter air like applause from an audience that appreciates dedication to cleanliness. Scrubbing involves ash, because soap is expensive and ash is free, mixed with sand for abrasive power, applied with frozen determination until your knuckles are red and raw and your hands feel like they belong to someone else. The clothes don't get clean by modern standards, but they get cleaner, which is progress. The wet clothes freeze on the way back to the house, because water has this inconvenient property of turning solid when exposed to freezing temperatures while you're carrying it. By the time you reach your door, you're carrying what amounts to fabric-shaped ice sculptures. You hang them near the fire and hope they dry before spring, which is sometimes optimistic thinking. The smell of wet wool drying by the fire becomes one of the defining scents of winter, along with wood smoke and the accumulated odors of people living in close quarters. By midday, your stomach is grumbling again with the insistence of an organ that's doing hard physical labor and needs fuel to continue. Lunch is pottage because of course it is. You add water to stretch yesterday's batch, stir to prevent sticking, and pretend it's a completely different meal from breakfast. Maybe there's a boiled root, turnip, parsnip, or carrot if you've been particularly blessed by the harvest gods. Maybe not. Either way, it's warm food in your belly, and that's something worth appreciating even if appreciation requires effort. You eat quickly because there are tools to fix, and tools in medieval times break constantly. Metal is expensive, wood wears out, and the daily use required for survival puts stress on everything you own. A broken tool isn't just inconvenience, it's a threat to your ability to complete the tasks that keep you alive. If you're lucky, you spend some time mending a hole in your cloak, the same cloak that serves as your blanket, your coat, your rain protection, and occasionally your towel. If you're unlucky, you stab yourself with the needle, which is both painful and wasteful of the small amount of blood you can afford to lose. Thread is precious, made from fibers you've grown, processed, and spun yourself. Running out of thread means you can't mend clothes, which means you get colder, which means you're less able to work, which means everything else gets harder. It's a cascade of consequences that starts with something as simple as using the last bit of thread. The roof needs patching because roofs in medieval times were not built to last. They were built to provide shelter right now, with the understanding that they would need constant maintenance and occasional complete replacement. A leak in winter isn't just annoying, it's dangerous. Water coming through the roof means wet bedding, which means colder sleep, which means less rest, which means less energy for the next day's survival tasks. Evening comes early in winter, too early, like the sun is giving up on the whole project of providing light and warmth, and has decided to call it a day while it's still afternoon by any reasonable measure. The days are short and the nights are long, and the transition between them is abrupt in a way that leaves you feeling like time itself is working against you. The wind picks up as darkness falls, creeping through every gap in the walls like an uninvited guest who's determined to make their presence known. You've stuffed the gaps with whatever you could find: rags, moss, mud, anything that might slow down the infiltration of cold air. But wind is persistent and creative, and it always finds new ways inside. Dinner is pottage. Take a wild guess. But dinner pottage is slightly different from breakfast pottage and lunch pottage because you've added whatever you managed to find during the day. Maybe some herbs, maybe a bit of preserved meat if it's a special occasion. Maybe just hope and determination to make the same meal feel different enough to be worth eating. The fire is going, barely. You've fed it throughout the day, but wood burns constantly and completely, and there's always the worry that you'll run out before you can replenish the supply. The smoke curls along the ceiling, looking for somewhere to escape, following air currents that lead to gaps you didn't know existed. You all sit near the hearth because that's where the warmth is. Backs hunched not from poor posture, but from the practical business of keeping as much of your body heat as possible contained within your clothes. You hold your bowls close, not just to eat, but for the warmth of the heated contents. Someone tells a story, not because it's a particularly good story, but because stories are free entertainment, and free entertainment is the only entertainment available. The stories get told and retold, embellished and modified, until they become communal property, shaped by the needs and interests of the audience. These aren't professional storytellers with polished repertoires. These are people who understand that narrative is one of the tools humans use to make sense of existence. And existence in medieval winter requires all the sense-making tools available. Outside you hear something that might be a wolf, or might be the wind, or might be a neighbor's dog, or might be nothing at all. Just the collection of sounds that winter nights produce when everything is quiet enough to hear the subtle noises that daylight activity usually covers. You pretend it's the wind, because pretending is easier than worrying about threats you can't do anything about anyway. You've gotten good at pretending, at the selective attention that focuses on manageable problems and ignores the ones that would keep you awake at night if you let them. When it's time to sleep, you do what you always do. Pile close together in an arrangement that maximizes shared body heat while minimizing the amount of space that needs to be warmed. One lumpy mattress that's really just a fabric sack stuffed with straw, 3 generations of your family. Because privacy is another luxury that survival doesn't allow. The goat named Marta has somehow convinced everyone that she belongs indoors, and honestly, she's warmer than most people, and only smells slightly worse than your cousin who hasn't changed clothes since October. Marta has strong opinions about sleeping arrangements, and isn't shy about expressing them through strategic positioning and pointed size. You curl up under the communal blanket, pull your section tight around your shoulders, and stare at the thatched roof above you. The thatch is visible in the dim light from the banked fire, a complex weaving of straw and branches that keeps most of the weather out most of the time. You count the drips from the small leaks that no amount of patching has completely eliminated. Drip from the northeast corner, the one that started last week. Drip from above the door, the persistent one that you've been meaning to fix but haven't gotten around to. Each drip has its own rhythm, its own personality, and you've given them names because naming things makes them less annoying somehow. You listen to the fire crackle and pop as the wood shifts and settles. It's your one soft sound in a world that never stops creaking. The house settling, the wind testing the walls. The small sounds of a structure that was built by hand and is held together by hope, skill, and whatever materials were available. The crackling of the fire is reassuring in a way that's hard to explain to someone who's never depended on fire for survival. It's the sound of warmth being created, of fuel being transformed into the energy that keeps you alive. As long as you can hear the fire, you know you'll make it through another night. Tomorrow will be the same. You'll wake up cold, work through the cold, eat the cold, sleep in the cold, and call it life, because that's what life is when you're a medieval peasant trying to survive winter. There's no such thing as a day off when every day requires the full range of survival skills just to maintain the basic necessities. A day off is a day when nothing collapses, when no one gets sick, when the tools don't break and the animals don't escape and the roof doesn't leak worse than usual. And honestly, that feels like a win. Not because the standards are low, but because the standards are real in a world where survival is never guaranteed. Making it through another day is genuinely an accomplishment worth celebrating, even if the celebration is just the quiet satisfaction of pulling a blanket over your head and knowing you'll get to try again tomorrow. The darker side of winter. Let's talk about the part of medieval winter no one puts on postcards. Because behind the frost-covered windows, if you even had windows, which you probably didn't, life got dark. Not just because the sun gave up and dipped out by late afternoon like a coworker leaving early on Friday, but because winter didn't just test your patience or your resolve. It tested your odds of survival with the methodical thoroughness of a particularly vindictive accountant. Winter was an audition for life, and not everyone got called back. Let's start with your health, or whatever was left of it after months of inadequate nutrition, constant cold, and the accumulated stress of survival. Everyone got sick in winter. Everyone. And we're not talking about cute little sniffles that could be cured with hot tea and a good night's sleep. You got full-body misery that arrived like an unwelcome houseguest and settled in for an extended stay. Coughs that rattled your chest like a haunted cupboard full of angry spirits. Joints that swelled until moving felt like operating a marionette with rusty strings. Fevers that made the walls melt and shift, and not in a fun, psychedelic way, more in a am I dying or just really, really sick way. The medieval immune system was basically running on fumes and hope. Poor nutrition meant your body had fewer resources to fight off illness. Constant cold meant your system was always under stress. Living in close quarters with other people meant that when one person got sick, everyone got sick, passing germs around like a very unwelcome gift exchange. And then there were the mystery illnesses, the ones that didn't have names because medical knowledge was still figuring out the difference between actual disease and divine punishment for insufficient piety. You'd wake up with symptoms that could be anything from scurvy to smallpox, and the diagnostic process was basically educated guessing combined with wishful thinking. There were no doctors in the modern sense, just people with varying degrees of knowledge, confidence, and success rates. The village healer, who smelled perpetually like moss and damp earth and had suspiciously strong opinions about the healing properties of onions. She'd examine you with the focused attention of someone who'd learned medicine through trial and error, mostly error, and had somehow managed to keep enough people alive to maintain her reputation. Her remedies came from generations of folk knowledge mixed with personal experimentation and the occasional lucky guess. Some of her treatments actually worked, based on genuine understanding of herbs and human physiology. Others worked through the power of placebo effect and the fact that many illnesses eventually go away on their own, and some probably made things worse, but she charged the same fee regardless of outcome. Then there was the priest, who approached illness from a spiritual angle and suggested that maybe your suffering was God's way of testing your faith, or possibly your fault for skipping Mass that one time last month, or perhaps a sign that you needed to donate more generously to the church building fund. His treatments involved prayer, confession, and the occasional relic that had allegedly touched something holy and might transfer some of that holiness to your infected wound. The priest meant well, mostly, but his medical training consisted primarily of God works in mysterious ways, and suffering builds character. He could offer comfort and hope, which were valuable commodities in the world where both were scarce, but his understanding of actual medicine was roughly equivalent to a modern person's understanding of quantum physics. He knew it existed and was probably important, but the details were fuzzy. Or there was the barber surgeon who showed up cheerful and confident, with a saw in one hand and a bottle of ale in the other, the ale being for him, not for you, because anesthesia hadn't been invented yet, and someone needed to stay steady during the cutting. His approach to medicine was refreshingly direct. If something hurt, cut it off. If that didn't work, cut off more. If the patient died, well, that was unfortunate, but at least you'd given it your best shot. The barber surgeon represented the cutting edge of medieval medicine, literally. He could set bones, amputate limbs, remove arrows, and perform basic surgery with the casual competence of someone who'd learned to ignore screaming and developed a philosophical attitude toward blood loss. He charged more than the healer or the priest, but he could actually do things. Dramatic, irreversible things that might save your life or might kill you faster, but were definitely memorable. The treatments available were a fascinating combination of ancient wisdom, religious faith, and enthusiastic ignorance. Bleeding was popular because the theory was that illness came from having too much blood, or the wrong kind of blood, or blood that was in the wrong place. The solution was obvious. Remove some blood and see if that helped. Sometimes it did, through coincidence, or because the patient was suffering from something that genuinely benefited from blood loss. Mostly it just made sick people weaker. Leeches were the sophisticated version of bleeding. Little medical professionals who knew exactly how much blood to take and when to stop. They were actually quite effective for certain conditions, and they had the advantage of being reusable, assuming you could keep them alive through winter. A good leech was a valuable medical tool, worthy of careful care and feeding. Hot rocks were applied to suspicious places based on the theory that heat could draw out illness, or balance the body's humors, or possibly just distract you from whatever was actually wrong. The rocks had to be hot enough to be therapeutic, but not so hot as to cause burns, which required a level of temperature control that was basically guesswork with consequences. Herbal teas were brewed from whatever plants hadn't died yet, which in winter wasn't many. The herb garden that flourished in summer became a collection of dried stems and faded memories, forcing healers to work with preserved materials that might or might not have retained their potency. Some of these teas genuinely helped. Willow bark tea actually contained compounds similar to modern aspirin, and chamomile really could calm upset stomachs. Others were basically hot water flavored with hope. All of these treatments, successful or not, tasted like regret and leaf mold. Medieval medicine hadn't discovered the concept of making treatments palatable, operating under the theory that if it tasted terrible, it was probably working. The worse something tasted, the more medicinal it obviously was, and through all of this, rest was a luxury you couldn't afford. You could be coughing up what felt like your last breath and still be expected to feed the chickens, because chickens don't care about your health problems and eggs don't lay themselves. The animals still needed care, the fire still needed feeding, and the daily survival tasks couldn't wait for you to feel better. Rest was for people who had other people to do their work for them. If you were a peasant, You were probably the only person available to do your work, which meant working through illness until you either got better or died trying. There was no sick leave, no disability benefits, no safety net beyond whatever help your neighbors could spare from their own overwhelming obligations. Then there was hunger. Real hunger, not the modern version where you forget to snack between lunch and dinner and feel peckish. This was the kind of hunger that gnawed at your insides like a persistent animal. The hunger that made you think about food constantly, that turned every conversation toward what you'd eaten, what you might eat, what you remembered eating back when eating was something you could take for granted. Medieval hunger was a slow-motion crisis that crept up on you gradually. First, meals got smaller, then meals got skipped, then meals became whatever you could find, forage, borrow, or trade for. If your winter stores ran out, and they often did, because estimating how much food you'd need to survive until spring was more art than science, you stretched your meals like a medieval economic advisor trying to make insufficient resources cover overwhelming needs. Pottage got thinner, watered down until it was more like flavored water than actual food. Bread got harder as you mixed in sawdust, bark, or whatever fibrous material might fool your stomach into thinking it was being fed. You chewed slower, not because it helped nutritionally, but because it made you feel like you were doing something constructive with the limited food available. The psychology of hunger was almost as challenging as the physical reality. You learned to think about food differently, to categorize potential nutrition sources by desperation level. What could be boiled to remove toxins? What could be chewed to extract whatever nutrients might be hiding in apparently inedible materials? What could be swallowed if you didn't think too hard about where it came from, or what it might do to your digestive system? You started looking at everything around you as potential food. Tree bark could be ground into flour if you had the tools and the energy. Grass could be boiled into soup if you could convince yourself it was soup. Roots could be dug up and cooked if the ground wasn't frozen solid, and if you could identify which roots wouldn't kill you. And yes, you eyed the rats differently, not just as thieves who stole your grain and contaminated your food stores, but as potential protein sources that were, technically speaking, meat. They were quick and clever and hard to catch, but they were also numerous and available, and in a world where available protein was precious, everything became a potential menu item. The rats probably looked back at you with similar calculations, wondering if the humans were getting weak enough to be overtaken by a particularly ambitious rodent coalition. It was a mutual assessment society where everyone was trying to figure out who might eat whom and under what circumstances. And if you're wondering about the extremes hunger could reach, yes, famine happened, often. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is the one historians write about because it was so widespread and well documented, but local famines happened regularly. Too much rain, too little rain, disease in the crops, war disrupting agriculture. Any number of factors would turn a marginal food situation into a full-scale crisis. When famine hit, it didn't just mean people went hungry. It meant social structures started breaking down. Desperate people made desperate choices. Families abandoned elderly members who couldn't contribute labor. Parents made impossible decisions about which children to feed. Communities that had shared resources in better times turned inward, protecting their own at the expense of outsiders. People died, of course, not dramatically usually, but quietly, gradually as their bodies consumed themselves trying to stay alive. People disappeared, walking away from communities that could no longer support them, heading toward rumors of better conditions elsewhere. Most of them probably died on the road, but staying meant certain death, so leaving felt like the only option. And people whispered about things that weren't talked about openly, about stew ingredients that weren't vegetables or conventional meat, about the practical mathematics of survival. when survival required choices that normal morality couldn't accommodate. About the point where human desperation overrode human taboos, and why some families never talked about exactly how they'd made it through the worst winters. These weren't monsters or aberrations. These were ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of what ordinary people should have to endure, making choices that haunt historical records and family memories for generations. The line between civilization and survival was thinner than anyone wanted to admit, and winter had a way of erasing that line entirely. Even if you managed to avoid sickness and had enough food to prevent starvation, you were still up against the weather itself, which treated human structures with the casual indifference of a force that had been shaping landscapes long before humans decided to build things on them. Roofs collapsed under the weight of snow that accumulated faster than it could be cleared. The engineering of medieval construction was basically, build it strong enough to last until we can build it again. And winter tested those limits regularly. You'd wake up to creaking sounds that meant the roof was considering a career change from overhead protection to large flat object resting on your bed. Frost didn't just make things cold, it made them brittle. Walls cracked as the moisture in the building materials froze and expanded. Stone foundations shifted as the ground beneath them went through freeze-thaw cycles that had been reshaping the landscape since the Ice Age. Wood warped and split as the moisture content changed with temperature and humidity. Mudslides were a constant threat in areas with slopes and poor drainage. Winter rain, mixed with melting snow, created rivers where none had existed before, carving new channels through carefully cultivated fields and occasionally rerouting themselves through people's homes. If you lived anywhere but on perfectly flat, well-drained ground, water was always trying to relocate your house to somewhere lower. The wealthy could pray in stone chapels that had been engineered by people who understood architecture and had access to quality materials. The poor prayed that their roofs would continue to be roofs rather than becoming very large, very heavy blankets that would require excavation to escape from. When someone died, which happened with the regular frequency of a natural process that hadn't been significantly modified by medical intervention, the ground was too frozen to bury them properly. Digging graves in frozen earth required tools, time, and energy that weren't always available when they were needed. So you waited. Bodies were stored in barns, root cellars, anywhere cold enough to preserve them until spring made burial possible. Families shared living space with deceased relatives, not out of sentiment, but out of practical necessity. Death became another household management issue, like storing food or managing fuel supplies. You'd light a candle if you had one to spare, whisper a prayer if you knew the right words, and try not to look too closely at the reminder of mortality that was sharing your storage space. Death wasn't hidden or sanitized. It was part of the seasonal cycle, like planting and harvesting, except the harvest was people, and the growing season was the time between birth and whatever finally killed you. This proximity to death changed how people thought about life. Death wasn't a distant possibility that might happen someday. It was a present reality that could happen today, tomorrow, or next week. This awareness made people simultaneously more fatalistic and more appreciative of whatever good things came their way. Then there were the fears you couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't reasonably prepare for. Bad luck that seemed to follow certain families or individuals. Bad spirits that haunted particular locations or times of year. Curses that explained why some people prospered while others suffered despite seemingly identical circumstances. These weren't necessarily supernatural beliefs in the modern sense. They were explanatory frameworks for a world where cause and effect weren't always obvious. When medicine couldn't explain illness, when weather patterns seemed random, when some families thrived while others failed despite similar efforts, supernatural explanations filled the gaps in understanding. You tied dried herbs over your bed, not because you necessarily believed in their magical properties, but because everyone else did it and it was a small effort that might help and definitely couldn't hurt. You hung iron nails in doorways because iron was supposed to repel certain kinds of negative influences, and iron was cheap enough that the potential benefits outweighed the minimal cost. You avoided certain woods after sunset, certain crossroads during certain weather, certain activities on certain days, not because you were superstitious in the sense of being irrational, but because the community had developed these practices based on generations of experience, and community wisdom was one of the few reliable sources of information available. If something went wrong, if you got sick, if your crops failed, if your animals died, you didn't want to be the one who hadn't taken the basic precautions that everyone agreed were sensible. Social cohesion was crucial for survival, and being seen as someone who ignored community standards could have consequences beyond just supernatural concerns. Religion was everywhere, woven into daily life with the intensity of a belief system that provided both comfort and control. But it wasn't the soft, comforting religion of a modern spiritual practice. It was cold and sharp, demanding and unforgiving, a religion that explained suffering as necessary and death as potentially merciful. The priest reminded you regularly that your suffering was holy, that it purified your soul and prepared you for a better life in heaven. Starvation built character. Pain taught humility. Death might be God's way of fast-tracking you to eternal reward, assuming you'd lived properly and tithed appropriately and confessed your sins thoroughly. This wasn't presented as optional comfort for people who found it helpful. It was presented as objective reality that you needed to accept if you wanted to be part of the community and have any hope of salvation. Questioning religious explanations wasn't just intellectually discouraged. It was socially dangerous and potentially eternally damaging. And you believed it. Or at least you said you believed it. Or at least you acted like you believed it. Because in winter, pretending was safer than questioning. Doubt was a luxury you couldn't afford when you needed every source of hope and community support available. If a cow got sick, it was a test of your faith and your farming practices. If your child died, it was a trial sent to strengthen your character and deepen your devotion. If the fire went out and someone didn't wake up the next morning, well, perhaps they weren't pious enough. Or perhaps God needed them in heaven more than you needed them on earth. These explanations served multiple purposes. They provided meaning for suffering that might otherwise seem random and unfair. They reinforced social cohesion by giving everyone a shared framework for understanding tragedy. And they placed responsibility for survival partly on divine will, which reduced the psychological burden of feeling personally responsible for every bad outcome. But they also created a weight of spiritual responsibility that made survival even more stressful. If your suffering was a test, then enduring it properly was crucial, not just for earthly survival, but for eternal salvation. If tragedy struck your family, you had to worry not just about practical consequences, but about what you might have done to deserve divine punishment. Grief was quiet and private, not because people didn't feel it deeply, but because expressing it too openly might suggest that you were questioning God's will or failing to accept divine judgment appropriately. There were no long ceremonies, no extended mourning periods, no social recognition of loss that might interfere with the practical business of staying alive. Just a name whispered near the hearth when no one else was listening. Maybe a candle lit during evening prayers. Maybe not, if candles were too precious to burn for purely sentimental reasons. Grief was folded into the daily routine like any other household task that needed to be managed efficiently. You didn't talk about the pain of loss, the fear of your own mortality, the exhaustion of living in constant survival mode. You folded those feelings, tucked them into some internal pocket where they couldn't interfere with the work that needed to be done, and stirred the soup anyway, because the chickens still needed feeding regardless of your emotional state. And tomorrow, would be just as cold regardless of how much you missed the people who weren't there to help you face it. The psychological toll of medieval winter wasn't just about individual suffering. It was about the accumulated weight of an entire community living on the edge of disaster for months at a time. Everyone was stressed, everyone was struggling, everyone was making impossible choices between competing survival priorities. And yet somehow people endured. They found ways to maintain their humanity even when circumstances seemed designed to strip it away. They shared what little they had, supported each other when they could, and created moments of beauty and meaning even in the depths of hardship. The darker side of medieval winter wasn't an aberration or a failure of medieval society. It was the context within which medieval society existed, the backdrop against which every other aspect of life was measured. Understanding that darkness isn't about dwelling on misery. It's about appreciating the incredible resilience it took to create anything good in circumstances that would challenge the strongest modern person. Tonight, as we drift towards sleep in our heated homes with our reliable food supplies and our modern medicine, we can honor those who faced winter with nothing but their own determination and whatever help they could offer each other. Their struggles were real, their losses were profound, and their survival was never guaranteed. But they survived long enough to become our ancestors, which means that somewhere in their DNA was the kind of stubborn resilience that refuses to give up even when giving up would be easier. And that resilience, passed down through generations, is part of what allows us to face our own winters, whatever form they might take. History doesn't always arrive with trumpets and fanfare, with kings making proclamations or armies marching across continents. Sometimes it slips in quietly, like frost creeping under the door on a December night, like hunger that arrives in March when you thought you had enough food stored to make it to spring, like the particular quality of silence that settles over a house after someone stops coughing, and you realize that the sound you'd grown accustomed to hearing every few minutes has simply ended. The big moments of history, the battles and plagues and political upheavals that fill textbooks, those grab attention because they're dramatic and decisive. But the small moments, the gradual changes that happen so slowly you don't notice them until they've already transformed everything, those are often more profound. They're the difference between surviving and thriving, between enduring and adapting, between a civilization that limps through difficult times and one that emerges stronger. Let's start with the cold. Not the everyday medieval cold that we've been talking about, the normal winter misery that people expected and prepared for as best they could. We're talking about something different, something that had a name because it was significant enough to require naming. The Little Ice Age. It wasn't an age in the epic sense that captures imagination. No dragons awakening from ancient slumber. No time travelers appearing to warn about climate catastrophe. No mystical ice queens casting spells across the landscape. Just centuries of colder than usual winters, starting somewhere around the 14th century and overstaying its welcome like a house guest who arrives for a weekend and doesn't leave until the 19th century. The Little Ice Age was what climatologists call a climate anomaly, which is a polite way of saying that the weather decided to ignore the usual patterns and do something else entirely for about 500 years. Global temperatures dropped by perhaps 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that 1 or 2 degrees can be the difference between a harsh winter and a catastrophic one, between crops that barely survive and crops that don't survive at all. The Thames in London froze solid, not once, as a freak occurrence that people talked about for decades afterward, regularly, predictably, annually for long stretches of time. The river that had been a liquid highway connecting London to the world became a solid platform that could support entire communities of temporary commerce and entertainment. They held festivals on the ice, frost fairs that transformed the frozen Thames into a carnival ground where merchants set up little tents to sell hot food, musicians played for crowds huddled in winter coats, and vendors hawked everything from commemorative trinkets to practical winter gear. There were puppet shows performed for audiences whose breath created clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Ice skating became a popular winter entertainment for those who could afford skates or could improvise them from whatever materials were available. The frost fairs weren't just entertainment, they were economic necessity. When the river froze, normal commerce stopped. Ships couldn't reach London's docks, goods couldn't be transported by water, and the usual patterns of trade had to be replaced by something else. The ice became a temporary marketplace, a solution born of adaptation to circumstances that no one had planned for, but everyone had to navigate. Until the ice cracked one year, and the Thames reminded everyone that frozen fun has consequences. People died when the ice gave way, falling through into water that was cold enough to kill within minutes. Entire sections of the temporary city that had been built on the ice disappeared overnight, taking with them the livelihoods of merchants who had invested everything in winter commerce. The tragedy wasn't just the immediate loss of life and property. It was the reminder that human adaptation to extreme conditions always came with risks that couldn't be completely eliminated. The frost fairs continued, but with more caution, more awareness that the ice that supported their community was fundamentally temporary and unreliable. In 1709, Europe experienced what historians still call the Great Frost, a winter so severe that it redefined what people thought was possible in terms of cold. This wasn't just harsh weather, it was a climate event that tested the limits of human survival across an entire continent. Wine turned to slush indoors, in cellars that had been specifically designed to maintain stable temperatures. The alcohol content that normally prevented freezing wasn't enough to protect against cold that penetrated even the most carefully insulated storage areas. Merchants watched their valuable inventory become unsellable, not because there was no demand, but because the product had literally changed its physical state. Chickens froze mid-cluck, their bodies stiffening while they were still attempting to make the sounds of normal chicken life. Farmers found their livestock arranged in whatever positions they'd been in when the cold finally overwhelmed their ability to generate body heat. The poultry that had been chattering and moving around their enclosures became silent sculptures, reminders of the speed with which extreme cold could transition life to death. Entire forests snapped under the weight of ice. The moisture in the air didn't just freeze. It accumulated on every surface until trees that had survived decades or centuries of normal winters buckled under the burden of carrying more ice than their structural integrity could support. The sound of forests collapsing echoed across the countryside like artillery fire, but the weapons were weather, and the casualties were landscapes that had seemed permanent. Trees exploded, literally exploded, as the sap inside them froze and expanded with enough force to split the wood from the inside out. These weren't small pops or cracks. They were detonations that sent fragments of wood flying like nature's own fireworks display. Walking through forests became dangerous not just because of the cold, but because trees could become bombs without warning. The sound of exploding trees was something no one had expected to add to their list of winter survival concerns. It was loud enough to wake people from sleep, startling enough to make them wonder if they were under attack, distinctive enough that once you'd heard it, you'd recognize it immediately if it happened again. In Germany, monks who kept detailed records of natural phenomena recorded that birds fell from the sky, dead mid-flight. These weren't birds that had been weakened by hunger or disease. They were healthy birds that had been flying normally until the cold simply overwhelmed their ability to maintain the body heat necessary for life. The sight of birds dropping from the sky like feathered hail became one of the defining images of that winter. The monks documented these events not just as curiosities, but as signs that the natural order had been disrupted in ways that required religious interpretation. Were these omens of divine displeasure, evidence of approaching apocalypse, or simply natural phenomena that fell outside their normal experience but didn't necessarily carry supernatural significance? In France, food prices tripled as transportation systems collapsed and agricultural production fell to levels that couldn't support normal consumption. Markets that had been reliable sources of basic necessities became luxury venues where only the wealthy could afford to eat adequately. The economic disruption wasn't just inconvenient. It was life-threatening for people who depended on stable food prices to survive. The price increases weren't just about supply and demand in the abstract economic sense. They represented the practical reality that moving food from where it was produced to where it was needed had become exponentially more difficult and expensive. Roads were impassable, rivers were frozen, and the animals that normally provided transportation were dying from the same cold that was killing everything else. In Sweden, the cold was so severe that wolves came into villages in daylight, bold and desperate and silent. These weren't the occasional nighttime raids that rural communities had learned to expect and defend against. These were daylight invasions by predators who had abandoned their normal patterns of behavior because their normal food sources had disappeared and human settlements represented the only remaining opportunity for survival. The wolves weren't just hungry. They were desperate in ways that made them dangerous beyond their normal capacity for threat. Desperate animals are unpredictable animals, capable of taking risks that well-fed animals would never consider. Villages that had coexisted with wolf populations for generations suddenly found themselves under siege by predators who had nothing left to lose. The silence of the wolves was perhaps more disturbing than their presence. Normally, wolf attacks were accompanied by howling, snarling, the sounds of predators communicating with their pack or expressing aggression toward prey. But these wolves moved with the quiet efficiency of creatures who had moved beyond normal predator behavior into something more fundamental. The simple mathematics of survival that reduced all other considerations to irrelevance. And through all of this, through temperatures that killed birds in flight and split trees from the inside out, through economic disruption that tripled food prices and social disruption that brought wolves into human settlements, peasants kept going. They wrapped themselves tighter in whatever layers of clothing they should accumulate. They slept closer together, maximizing shared body heat and minimizing the space that needed to be warmed. And they watched the sky like it owed them something better, like patient creditors waiting for weather to pay its debt of normal seasonal patterns. The persistence of ordinary people through extraordinary circumstances is one of the most remarkable aspects of historical records from the Little Ice Age. While chroniclers documented the dramatic events, the exploding trees and falling birds and invading wolves, they also recorded the quieter story of human adaptation to conditions that should have been unsurvivable. Communities developed new strategies for sharing resources, for maximizing the efficiency of heating systems, for maintaining social cohesion when individual survival might have seemed to require abandoning community obligations. Children learned skills that their grandparents had never needed. Elderly people shared knowledge that became suddenly relevant again after generations of irrelevance. But winter during the Little Ice Age wasn't always about the cold. Sometimes, paradoxically, it was about the water, or more precisely, about too much water in the wrong places at the wrong times, and not enough water in the right places when it was needed. Take 1315, a year that began with hope and ended in rot. A year that started with optimism about good harvests and concluded with some of the worst famine in recorded European history. It was a year that demonstrated how quickly normal weather patterns could shift into catastrophic ones, and how little margin for error existed in medieval agricultural systems. The year 1315 began normally enough. Spring arrived on schedule, Farmers prepared their fields according to generations of accumulated wisdom, and there was no reason to expect anything other than the usual cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting that had sustained European agriculture for centuries. Rain started in spring, which was not unusual. Spring rain was expected, welcomed, necessary for the crops that would feed everyone through the following winter. But this rain never really stopped. It continued through late spring into early summer, through the season when crops needed sun and warmth to mature, through the critical harvest time when dry weather was essential for gathering and preserving grain. Fields drowned under the constant deluge. Crops that had been planted in carefully prepared soil found themselves submerged under standing water that prevented normal growth and encouraged rot. Grain that had been growing normally suddenly found itself in conditions that resembled rice paddies more than wheat fields, and European grains were not adapted to wetland agriculture. The rain wasn't just heavy, it was relentless. Chronicles from the time describe months of continuous precipitation that turned the landscape into a collection of shallow lakes connected by rivers of mud. Villages that had been built on slightly elevated ground found themselves isolated by water, connected to the outside world only when the rain paused long enough for travel to become possible. Cattle starved in fields that had become marshes. Animals that had been grazing on solid ground found themselves standing in ankle-deep mud, trying to find edible vegetation in an environment where most plant life was either drowned or rotted. Livestock that couldn't be moved to higher ground simply died where they stood, their bodies becoming part of the landscape of disaster that was reshaping the countryside. And then people began to starve too. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, as food stores that had been adequate for normal circumstances proved insufficient for the extended crisis that the endless rain had created. The transition from abundance to scarcity happened slowly enough that communities had time to implement rationing systems, to search for alternative food sources, to hope that the next harvest would be better. But the next harvest was worse, and the one after that, the Great Famine, as historians now call it, lasted from 1315 to 1322, 7 years of agricultural failure that fundamentally changed European society and demonstrated the fragility of civilizations that depended entirely on weather cooperation for survival. Chronicles from the period provide detailed accounts of the adaptive strategies that communities developed to cope with prolonged food shortage. Villagers waded through knee-deep mud just to salvage a few turnips, not because turnips were particularly nutritious or appealing, but because they were among the few crops that could survive in waterlogged soil long enough to provide any nutrition at all. The image of people wading through mud to harvest inadequate root vegetables became one of the defining visual metaphors of the famine period. It represented the distance between normal agricultural practice and survival agriculture, between farming as a productive activity and farming as a desperate search for anything edible. Bread, the staple food that had sustained European populations for centuries, was made with filler. Bark, straw, sawdust, sometimes even powdered bones from animals that had died during the crisis. Bakers, who had traditionally been proud craftsmen creating products that were both nutritious and appealing, became survival engineers trying to create something that could be swallowed and would provide calories, regardless of taste or texture. The addition of non-traditional ingredients to bread wasn't just about extending limited grain supplies. It was about finding ways to make inedible materials digestible. Bark could be ground into powder that would provide bulk and possibly some nutritional value. Straw could be processed into a fiber that would help people feel full even if it didn't provide significant calories. Bones could be ground into meal that would add calcium and perhaps some protein to diets that had become deficient in almost everything. People ate anything, everything. The normal distinctions between food and non-food, between safe and unsafe, between culturally acceptable and culturally taboo, all disappeared under the pressure of survival necessity. Grass became soup ingredients. Leather became something to chew on for whatever nutrition could be extracted. Even things that had never been considered food became potential sources of calories when calories became scarce enough. The psychological adaptation required to eat things that had never been food was perhaps as challenging as the physical adaptation required to digest them. Communities had to collectively agree to suspend normal food categories, to redefine nutrition in ways that allowed survival without completely abandoning the social structures that held people together. People whispered about darker adaptations, about neighbors who disappeared and families who seemed to have more food than their circumstances should have allowed, about stew that smelled different, that contained ingredients no one wanted to identify too closely, about the practical mathematics of survival, when survival required choices that normal morality couldn't accommodate. The whispers were never accusations exactly, because accusations would have required evidence, and evidence would have required investigations that no one wanted to conduct. They were more like acknowledgments that extraordinary circumstances sometimes led to extraordinary choices, and that understanding those choices might be beyond the moral framework that worked for normal times. If your neighbor disappeared and the stew smelled different, no one asked questions because asking questions might lead to answers that would make community life impossible. The social contract during famine periods required a kind of willful ignorance that allowed survival without forcing communities to confront the full implications of what survival might require. By the end of the Great Famine, historians estimate that around 10–15% of the European population was gone. Not lost in battle, not claimed by enemy armies or political upheaval, but simply gone. Soil had turned to soup, making agriculture impossible across vast regions. Food had turned to memory, something people talked about from better times but couldn't access in present circumstances. Families had turned to stories no one wanted to tell, histories that were passed down in whispers or not passed down at all. The demographic impact of the Great Famine was comparable to major wars or plague outbreaks, but it happened gradually enough that communities had time to adapt, to reorganize, to develop new social structures that could function with significantly reduced populations. Villages were abandoned, not dramatically but slowly, as people moved away in search of better conditions or simply died where they were. But even in the worst years, when survival seemed to require abandoning everything that made life worth living, people adapted. Human adaptability during crisis periods is one of the most remarkable features of historical records from this period. Communities that should have collapsed instead found ways to reorganize, to share resources more efficiently, to maintain social cohesion, even when individual survival might have seemed to require abandoning community obligations. In some villages, communal ovens stayed hot all day, providing a central resource that individual families couldn't have maintained separately. These weren't just cooking facilities. They were community centers where people gathered to share news, to coordinate survival strategies, to maintain the social connections that made survival psychologically as well as physically possible. You'd wait your turn to use the oven, not just as a matter of practical scheduling, but as a participant in a community ritual that reinforced social bonds. Baking your bread in the communal oven meant contributing fuel to keep the fire going, sharing heat with neighbors who needed it, participating in a collective effort that made everyone's survival more likely. The communal ovens also created opportunities for resource sharing that wouldn't have existed if everyone had tried to maintain individual cooking fires. Someone who had grain but no fuel could trade with someone who had fuel but no grain. Someone who had bread but no vegetables could share with someone who had vegetables but no bread. The oven became a focal point for the kind of economic cooperation that turned individual scarcity into community adequacy. But you had to try not to notice things that might have disrupted community harmony, like how Agnes's hands were always suspiciously warm, warmer than they should have been if she were truly struggling with fuel shortages like everyone else. Suspiciously warm hands might indicate access to heat sources that others didn't have, which might indicate access to resources that others couldn't obtain, which might indicate survival strategies that others didn't want to examine too closely. In other villages, wood rationing became a community effort that transformed individual resource management into collective survival planning. Families couldn't afford to compete for limited fuel supplies because competition would have meant that some people would have adequate heat while others froze, which would have meant that the community as a whole would have lost people it couldn't afford to lose. So you chopped wood together, pooling labor and tools to maximize efficiency. Multiple people working together could cut more wood in less time than the same people working individually. And cutting wood together meant that everyone understood exactly how much fuel was available and how it needed to be distributed to keep everyone alive. You froze together, sharing the experience of discomfort in ways that made individual suffering feel less isolating. When everyone was cold, being cold became a shared condition rather than a personal failure. When everyone was struggling, struggling became a community characteristic rather than an individual weakness. You laughed a little less than you had during better times, because humor requires a kind of psychological surplus that was hard to maintain when survival consumed most of your mental and physical resources. But you survived all the same, because survival had become a community project rather than an individual challenge. The transformation of survival from an individual to a collective responsibility was one of the most significant social changes that emerged from crisis periods like the Great Famine. Communities that had previously operated on principles of individual or family self-sufficiency reorganized around principles of mutual aid and resource sharing that made survival possible for more people than would have survived through individual effort alone. These weren't temporary emergency measures that people planned to abandon as soon as circumstances improved. They were fundamental changes in how communities organized themselves, changes that often persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed, because they proved to be more effective than previous systems for dealing with the kind of uncertainties that characterized medieval life. The Little Ice Age and the Great Famine were the kind of historical events that reshaped not just individual lives but entire civilizations. They changed how people thought about weather, about food security, about community responsibility, about the relationship between human planning and natural forces beyond human control. But they were also demonstrations of human adaptability under pressure, examples of how people can reorganize their lives and communities when existing systems prove inadequate for new challenges. The survival strategies that emerged during these crisis periods weren't just stopgap measures. They were innovations that improved the resilience of European society for centuries afterward. And then there were the plagues. Yes, plural, because medieval Europe wasn't content with just one catastrophic disease outbreak. It collected them, the way some people collect stamps or vintage coins. Except the collection was written in graveyards, and the catalog was kept in church records that documented the steady disappearance of entire family lines. Everyone knows about the Black Death in the 1340s, the Great Plague that swept across Europe like a dark wave, killing somewhere between 30% and 60% of the population, depending on which historian you ask and which region you're discussing. It's the plague that gets mentioned in textbooks, the one that gets dramatized in movies, the one that serves as the ultimate example of medieval mortality and social disruption. But here's what those textbooks don't always emphasize. It wasn't just one wave. The Black Death came back, again and again and again, like a particularly persistent house guest who keeps returning uninvited, bringing death and economic disruption with each visit. The initial outbreak of 1347 to 1351 was devastating enough to reshape European society fundamentally. Cities lost half their populations. Villages were abandoned entirely. Trade networks collapsed. Agricultural systems broke down when there weren't enough people left to work the fields. Social hierarchies crumbled when death proved to be remarkably egalitarian in its selection criteria. But the plague didn't disappear after its first dramatic appearance. It settled into European life like a new seasonal pattern, returning every 10 to 20 years with the regularity of a natural cycle that communities learned to expect and dread. Each return was smaller than the initial outbreak, but still significant enough to disrupt whatever recovery had been achieved since the previous visitation. The plague of 1361 to 1362 was known as the mortality of children because it seemed to particularly target young people who had been born after the first outbreak and had no previous exposure to build immunity. Families that had survived the initial plague and begun rebuilding their lives watched their children die from the same disease that had claimed their grandparents. The plague of 1369 hit urban areas particularly hard, disrupting the commercial recovery that had been slowly rebuilding European trade networks. The plague of 1374 to 1375 coincided with particularly harsh winters, creating combined mortality from disease and starvation that some regions never fully recovered from. Each outbreak had its own characteristics, its own patterns of spread, its own particular cruelties. Some seemed to prefer urban areas with dense populations and extensive trade connections. Others spread through rural areas where people thought they were safer from urban diseases. Some killed quickly, allowing communities to respond and adapt. Others lingered, creating prolonged periods of uncertainty where families never knew when the next death would occur. In some villages, entire families vanished in weeks, not dramatically, not with final speeches or heroic last stands, but quietly, gradually, as household after household fell silent. The family that had been arguing about property boundaries on Monday would be gone by Friday, their house standing empty, their fields reverting to weeds, their names remembered only in church records that documented the transfer of property to distant relatives who might or might not ever arrive to claim it. In other places, they were buried in layers, grandmother, mother, daughter, all beneath the same patch of frozen earth, because the ground was too hard to dig separate graves, and there weren't enough living people to manage individual burial ceremonies. The layered burials weren't just practical solutions to practical problems. They were symbols of how completely the plague could erase family structures that had existed for generations. The winter plague burials were particularly challenging because frozen ground made digging graves nearly impossible with medieval tools. Communities developed techniques for creating communal burial sites where multiple bodies could be interred efficiently when spring made grave digging possible again. Bodies were stored in churches, barns, any cold space that could preserve them until proper burial became feasible. It wasn't loud, the dying. That was perhaps the worst part. Movies and stories suggest that plague deaths were dramatic affairs with screaming and chaos and visible suffering. But most plague deaths were quiet. People would develop symptoms, weaken gradually, and then simply stop. The silence was more disturbing than screaming would have been, because silence suggested that death had become so routine that it no longer warranted emotional response. Families would wake up to discover that someone who had been talking yesterday was no longer breathing today. Children would go to bed in houses with 5 people and wake up in houses with 3. The quiet accumulation of death was more psychologically challenging than dramatic death because it didn't allow for the kind of emotional processing that comes with obvious tragedy. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed communities. Social structures that had developed over generations disappeared when there weren't enough survivors to maintain them. Craft guilds collapsed when master craftsmen died before they could train apprentices. Agricultural knowledge was lost when experienced farmers died before they could pass their expertise to the next generation. But the plague also created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed before. Surviving peasants found themselves able to demand higher wages because labor had become scarce. Women inherited property that would normally have gone to male relatives who had died. Young people found themselves in positions of responsibility that they never would have achieved under normal demographic circumstances. The economic disruption caused by recurring plague outbreaks was almost as significant as the direct mortality. Labor shortages meant that fields went unplanted, goods went unproduced, and trade networks that depended on reliable production schedules broke down. But labor shortages also meant that surviving workers could negotiate better working conditions and higher wages than their ancestors had ever imagined possible. The psychological impact of living with recurring plague was perhaps more profound than the immediate mortality. Communities developed a kind of chronic anxiety about disease that influenced everything from architecture to social customs. People avoided large gatherings, modified their religious practices, changed their attitudes toward travel and trade, but they also developed resilient strategies that helped them cope with uncertainty. Communities that survived multiple plague outbreaks learned to maintain flexible social structures that could function with varying population levels. They developed economic systems that could adapt to sudden changes in labor availability. They created cultural practices that helped people process grief and loss without becoming completely overwhelmed by trauma. Still, even with plague recurring like a deadly seasonal pattern, history didn't stop. Life continued around the edges of catastrophe, finding ways to persist even when persistence seemed impossible. The remarkable thing about medieval plague records isn't just the documentation of death, it's the documentation of life continuing despite death. Some winters, the great equalizing power of weather reminded everyone that social status provided no protection against natural forces. Kings froze just like commoners, demonstrating that power over people didn't translate into power over physics. In 1431, during the trial of Joan of Arc, one of the most politically significant legal proceedings of the medieval period, they say the courtroom was so cold that spectators wrapped their feet in straw to prevent frostbite. The judges, these powerful men who held the authority to determine life and death for the most famous woman in France, wore fur under their robes like anyone else who wanted to stay warm. Their judicial authority didn't extend to control over the weather, and their legal proceedings had to accommodate the same physical realities that governed peasant life. Joan stood there barefoot throughout the trial, not because she was indifferent to cold, but because she was a prisoner who wasn't provided with adequate clothing or footwear. The contrast between the judges bundled in furs and the defendant standing barefoot in a freezing courtroom became one of the visual symbols of the trial, a reminder that justice proceedings still had to contend with basic physical realities. The cold courtroom wasn't just a minor inconvenience that made the trial uncomfortable. It was a demonstration that even the most important political and religious events of the medieval period took place within the same environmental constraints that governed ordinary life. The men who were deciding Joan's fate had to blow on their hands to keep their fingers warm enough to write their verdict. Power meant nothing to the weather. Cold was democratically distributed regardless of social rank, economic status, or political authority. It froze the Pope's wine just as easily as a farmer's tears, treating the liquid in expensive goblets with the same physical laws that governed moisture in peasant hovels. The Pope's wine freezing wasn't just a colorful metaphor. It was a documented reality during the worst winters of the Little Ice Age. The Vatican, with all its wealth and architectural sophistication, still couldn't completely insulate itself from weather that was determined to penetrate every space where humans tried to maintain warmth. Church services were conducted in buildings where breath was visible and fingers became too stiff to turn pages properly. The democratizing effect of extreme weather was one of the few forces in medieval society that truly ignored social hierarchy. Nobles might have better heating systems, warmer clothing, and more reliable food supplies, but they couldn't opt out of winter entirely. They still had to deal with the same basic survival challenges as everyone else, just with better resources for meeting those challenges. But through it all, through recurring plague outbreaks that decimated populations, through winters that killed indiscriminately across social classes, through famines that lasted for years, and climate changes that persisted for centuries, people kept going, not because they were particularly brave or heroic or possessed of superhuman endurance, because there was literally no other choice. The alternative to keeping going was death, and most people most of the time chose life even when life was difficult beyond modern comprehension. They chose to continue the daily routines of survival, even when survival required constant effort and provided no guarantee of success. They chose to maintain hope even when hope seemed irrational. You fed the fire every morning because fires don't feed themselves and cold will kill you if you let it. You watched the sky for signs of weather changes, because weather changes could mean the difference between having enough food to last until spring and starving before the growing season arrived. You performed these daily survival rituals not because you were optimistic about the future, but because performing them was the only way to have a future at all. You didn't write your name in history books because history books were written by and about people who had enough wealth and education to leave written records. You carved your existence, one frostbitten morning at a time, into the walls of a hut that barely held together, literally carving marks that indicated days survived, winters endured, family members who had lived and died in spaces that were too small and too cold but were still home. The physical marks that ordinary people left on their environment were their historical records. Scratches on door frames that measured children's growth, notches in beams that counted years or seasons or harvests, wear patterns on floors that showed where people walked, worked, lived their daily lives. These weren't intended as historical documents, but they became the most authentic records of how most people actually lived. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Not the battles that get commemorated in monuments, not the kings whose reigns get marked in textbooks, but the quiet moments of persistence that don't get recorded anywhere except in the accumulated evidence of lives lived despite overwhelming challenges. The mornings where someone lit the fire anyway, even though they'd lit the same fire yesterday, and would have to light it again tomorrow, even though the fire consumed resources that were precious and scarce, even though keeping the fire going was just one more task in an endless list of tasks required for survival. The nights where someone shared the last piece of bread, not because sharing was easy or because they had bread to spare, but because sharing was how communities survived when individual survival became impossible. The decision to give half of your inadequate dinner to your neighbor's hungry child, knowing that your own hunger would be worse tomorrow, but that the child's survival might depend on those calories tonight. The hands that kept spinning thread even when the wind screamed outside and the house shook and the world seemed to be ending again. the steady, repetitive motion of creating something useful from raw materials, of transforming plant fibers into thread that could become cloth, that could become clothing that could help someone stay warm. The quiet productivity that continued regardless of external circumstances, because stopping productivity meant stopping life. These moments of persistence weren't heroic in the dramatic sense that captures attention in stories. They were heroic in the fundamental sense of choosing to continue living when continuing required constant effort and offered no guarantee of success. They were the daily decisions to maintain humanity when circumstances seemed designed to strip humanity away. The big moments that history remembers, the battles and plagues and political upheavals that get documented in chronicles and textbooks, they started small, in places like the ones we've been imagining, with people like the ones we've been following, people who simply decided each morning to keep going. The Black Death didn't begin as a continent-wide catastrophe. It began with individual people in individual households making individual decisions about how to respond when their neighbors started dying. The Little Ice Age didn't begin as a climate anomaly that would last for centuries. It began with individual people in individual communities noticing that winters were getting harder and deciding to adapt their survival strategies accordingly. The great historical transformations that reshaped medieval society were made up of millions of small decisions by ordinary people who were just trying to make it through another day, another winter, another crisis that tested their ability to continue existing in a world that often seemed actively hostile to human survival. Tonight, as we settle into sleep in our climate-controlled homes with our reliable food supplies and our sophisticated disease prevention systems, we can appreciate the ingenuity and persistence of people who faced recurring catastrophes without any of the technological or institutional resources we take for granted. Their survival was never guaranteed, their comfort was minimal, and their safety was always provisional. But they created the foundation for everything that came after, including the world we inhabit now. They passed down not just their genes, but their knowledge, their adaptive strategies, their cultural innovations that made survival possible under impossible conditions. They demonstrated that human beings can endure almost anything if they're willing to keep making the daily choice to continue living, to keep feeding the fire, to keep sharing what little they have, to keep believing that tomorrow might be marginally better than today. Their legacy isn't written in stone monuments or preserved in official records. It's written in the simple fact that we exist, that their persistence through medieval catastrophes was successful enough that their descendants eventually developed the technological and social systems that make our lives possible. Every morning when we wake up warm and fed and safe, we're benefiting from the accumulated survival wisdom of people who chose to keep going when keeping going seemed impossible. And now here you are, still lying there, I hope. Maybe your blanket has shifted just a bit. Maybe the room is quiet except for the soft hum of something modern. A heater, a fridge, a cat snoring gently on your feet. The medieval winter is behind us now. You've trudged through frozen mornings, skipped meals, patched holes in walls, and boiled soup with more water than flavor. You've survived the coughs, the cold, the quiet desperation that crept in with the snow, and all without getting up from bed. Well done. So now, breathe. Because you're not in a thatched hut, your roof doesn't leak. Your bread didn't fight back when you tried to slice it. Your fire, if you even need one, is probably electric and politely contained in a sleek little box with a safety switch. No wolves tonight, no rationing, no priest asking about your tithes or your sins or why you sneezed during Mass last Sunday. Just you, warm, alive, and not ankle-deep in medieval mud. History tends to focus on battles and kings, but survival, the quiet, exhausting, splinter-filled kind, that's where the real stories live. Not with the people who ruled empires, but with the ones who just tried to stay warm long enough to see a single green sprout push up through the frost. So next time your Wi-Fi's slow, or your coffee's lukewarm, or your blanket isn't quite tucked under your feet the way you like it, remember this. You could be trying to start a fire with numb fingers and wet moss. You could be counting turnips in February. You could be praying your thatched roof doesn't collapse in the night again, but you're not. You're here, you're breathing, and that even now is its own kind of miracle. So sleep well, my friend. Rest easy under your modern roof with your central heating and your unnervingly soft pillow. Let the weight of old winters melt away. Let the past stay quiet. You've earned a night without chores, without firewood, without wolves. And if you're still awake, just barely, remember, you made it. Not through a war, not through a plague, not through a famine, just through another day. And in the quiet rhythm of history, that's always been enough. Good night. And may your dreams be warm, well-fed, and blessedly uneventful.